Hello world, I am Curtis Simpson and this is the Curtis Simpson and this is the Objectives Review of Designing Type by Karen Cheng, second edition. I have previously read the first edition of this book, but I recently moved to Brazil and I do not have any of my design books with me. So a viewer asked if I could review this book. I thought it was a great opportunity to purchase the second edition and read through it again. And I was not disappointed with the new edition. There are some improvements that I'll point out, and I think it's definitely worth looking at, even if you already own the first edition. For most of this review, though, I will be doing this as if you've never read the book. So I'll be pointing out a lot of things in detail, discussing some of my opinions, and long story short, yes, I do recommend this book, and I will get into all the reasons why. Before we crack open the spine, I do want to point out this is like I said, it's the second edition. This was printed in 2020. The first edition was printed in 2005. Neither edition is available in hardbound, so you're going to have softbound books. It's not a deal breaker for me. I do wish that it was available in hardback, just because I think this is a book that you're going to use for reference a lot, and it's probably a book that you're going to have setting open on your desk a lot if you're actually designing a typeface. So that would have been nice, but it's not available. So this is what your option is. If you're going to get the book, you're going to get it in softbound. The quality though, I'm just going to compare this to a couple of other books that we've reviewed on the channel before we get started. I'll go ahead and open it. The paper compared to Grid Systems by Josef Müller-Brockmann, I would say is not quite as luxurious. I don't know. It's not quite as nice. It is good paper. I don't think there's going to be any problems with it. The prose, it's very white, so it's very bright, so that the text is very crisp, and the paper is very smooth. Sometimes, when you read a good hardbound book, the paper is nice and soft. Maybe it's a little bit off-white, so you can have maybe a little bit more pleasant reading experience. So like the inside of this is a little bit off-white. Maybe you can see the difference on the screen. So the paper is very white, very crisp. The prose, in terms of comparing this to the last two books, I think that the language in this is much easier to read. The writing voice is much easier to read than Grid Systems. Grid Systems, like I pointed out in that review, is very technical and very professional. This is professional, but much less so in a very technical, formal way. It's much more approachable, much easier to read, but it's not quite as conversational as Thinking with Type. So I'm not sure there's going to be a lot of people choosing between this and Thinking with Type, but if you are, and you're a very beginner and you've never read Thinking with Type, go with Thinking with Type. It's a shorter book. It covers way more topics, and then come back to this later if you learn about typography and you're like, oh, I want to create a font. Then come to this because you will understand the basics better. And I just think that Thinking with Type is a more general. I would recommend that to way more people than this. This book is essentially a user manual on how to create a typeface, how to design a typeface. Okay, let's get into it. Here we have the table of contents. So you might not be able to see this very well on the screen, but I'll just go ahead and walk through a little bit of it. Everything to the left of this is kind of an introduction. Everything afterwards is really that user manual that I was talking about, where you're really going to be focused on, here's how you create the letter O, the letter E, the letter F. But we start out with a little bit of an introduction, some about the design process, variables in type design, and that's not variable fonts. That's just, that's axis, stress, serifs, terminals, sans serif, stroke endings, all the little details that make a font have the character that it has, and essentially the classification that it's going to be given. And the third chapter is spacing, which is an incredibly important thing to understand for the entirety of this book. Once you get those introductory parts out of the way, she goes through very, very systematically. This isn't a book that you would want to design out of order. I wouldn't go design the numbers first and then come back to lowercase and then go to uppercase. This is very much in an order that makes sense, and it's very purposeful in the order that it's written. So it starts with uppercase, lowercase, numbers, punctuation, diacritical marks, and then she's got some appendices at the end here. The uppercase, though, like I said, it's not just going out of order in the sections. The entire book builds upon itself. So first you're deciding proportions, but then you're starting with the letter O, the letter E, and then from the letter E, you're building off and you're making F, H, I, L, T. So it's like studying a math book, right? You don't just skip to the middle of the book and start designing the capital A. No, you have to learn how to design the V first, and the V comes from all these other things. So you really, really need to go in order. And I know maybe I'm stressing that point a little bit too much, but it is important to understand how this book's going to function. Just a little bit of an introduction between the first edition and the second edition, and then we get into the design process. Design process. So the first thing you're presented with is a page about motivations. And the question here is, why design a new font? Why create a new typeface? There are hundreds of thousands of typefaces now. It says right here there's estimated 300,000 individual fonts. I don't know that I don't know that I have anything truly insightful to say about that, but what I will say is that this is a big book, and one thing I learned is that designing a typeface is a very long, very difficult process, very tedious process, I guess is probably the best word for it. It's very iterative and it's very tedious. So if you don't have a good motivation for why you're designing your font, I think you're very likely to give up. So have a good motivation. One thing I'll say is that the body copy in this book, we're looking at a couple of examples here, but the body copy in this book is very pleasant to read. This typeface, I didn't look up what these two typefaces are. There's a sans serif and a serif here, but they are very pleasant to read, but they might be a little bit small for some people. I would guess that they're probably 10 or 11 point on here. They're not super big, so if you are somewhat vision impaired, this book might be a pass for you, because it really, there's no digital version for it. There's no enlarging the text on this. So you get what you get, and while I personally find it very pleasant to read, it's not very big. So the next thing I'll point out is this here. You can see these are citations. I love this. I actually had to stop myself from writing all of these down as I went through, because there are so many great rabbit holes to dive down, so many citations, so many things you're going to want to look up. These being in line is a great thing, because sometimes something will be referenced in the paragraph. She's got them numbered here like a good book does. One thing I will say though is that these are separate from the further reading that we're going to look at later in the back. So Appendix 3 is further reading, and it's got a lot of great books, a lot of great magazines, type designers, different things like that. These are not the same as the ones that are cited here. I do think that it would have been nice to have all of these citations in one place at the back of the book, maybe another appendix that's just like works cited or something. But you'll see some of these are even, specific URLs and things like that. So it's really cool to have here, especially in line. I love that we don't have to flip back and forth, but I do kind of wish that they existed all in one place at the end of the book as well. One thing I will say about this drawing letter section, I really appreciate that the author doesn't give you like a prescriptive, this is the right way to do it. That was one thing in Joseph Mueller-Brockmann's grid systems. He's very prescriptive with what he felt was the right and wrong way to do things, and that's fine. But I appreciate that the author in this, she basically goes through and talks to different designers and gets their opinions on how they approach things, and then kind of says, here are the way that other people do it. There's not a perfect way. Figure out your own way, kind of. But she does give some starting points and things like that. The last thing in this first section here is there are two case studies. I'll just go ahead and flip through these real quick so we can see the second one. So there are two case studies. One is for reviving a typeface and the other for workroom sans. And I'm not 100% sure. I know one of these are a student work, maybe both of them are, but I know that this one is a student project. I'm not sure about this one. But I think that these are very useful in the beginning just to kind of get an idea of the overall process in general, how someone goes about creating either a brand new typeface or reviving an old one. And while these are brief, I do think that they give a good insight into what's to come. And that will bring us to chapter 2, variables in type design. And I'm just going to point out something right now. Every chapter number is a different font. So typically, I think that this is something that you would want to avoid because it wouldn't provide good consistency. Let me just flip through all of them real quick. But I do think that it's really fun that these have all been printed. I'm not going to actually go through all of them. We'll go through the first 4. But you can see a few different examples there. I do think that it's really cool, just kind of a fun little Easter egg that she used a different typeface for each chapter. Type terminology. We see this called a lot of different things. She's referring to it as type terminology. I believe in thinking with type, it was type anatomy maybe. But I will point out right away, this is much, much more detailed than thinking with type, and rightfully so, because you really need to understand all of this. You need to at least put a post-it on this page so that you can refer back to it, because you need to understand all of these different titles: crossbar, vertex, apex, beak, stem, because they're constantly going to be referenced throughout the book. And so I think this does a very, very good job of pointing out all of the different definitions, the different names for the type, for the parts of a character in a typeface, and even down to this section here when you're looking at capitals, lowercase, but she's also got alternate names for it. So capitals can also be referred to as majuscules or uppercase. Lowercase can be called minuscules. You've got italics, text figures, lining figures, which can also be uppercase or lowercase. So there's just a ton of terminology in these 2 pages alone, and you will 100% want to stick a post-it on here so you can flip back to this page really quick. I can't believe that I did not understand this, or I didn't grasp this up until now. You know, I had classes in typography. I didn't have like an actual type design class during my graphic design studies, but I never realized, I knew that the early typefaces were calligraphic or based on calligraphy, but I didn't understand how the pens actually worked in terms of, you can see here, in terms of like a broad-nibbed pen versus a fountain pen, and that's how you're getting that contrast. So I thought that was really cool. Maybe you are thinking, Curtis, you're a dummy. Of course, everybody knows that. But I think if you're a beginner, especially a beginner to type design, like myself, then I think that that's kind of like a really interesting thing. And if you were wanting to be more true to the origins, you know, you could go pick up a fountain pen or a broad-nibbed pen and kind of play around with it to see what the strokes would look like. I think this page here, we're just looking at serifs and terminals and sans serif stroke endings. So all we're doing now is looking at how the letters end. And I think this is going to be the moment, if you hadn't already realized it, that there are so many potential characteristics that you can add to a typeface to really make it your own. And I think this is where at least my mind starts to run wild, and I think about, oh, which ones do I like the most? Oh, which ones would go with the style of font that I would want? What kind of, you know, like how do these bracketed ball terminals compare to the unbracketed ball terminals, and what kind of voice does that add to my typeface? I just think your mind is going to start to run wild as soon as you start to see all of the potential. And that's a great thing, because I think that's going to inspire you to, get through this book and potentially create a typeface of your own. X height. She mentions that X height is probably one of the most important characteristics in terms of like the voice and the classification. After like actual classification, which we'll get to later. Well, let's go ahead and flip to it real quick. It's in the index, and we'll get to this at the end. But so you can see the classifications here in the back. It's pretty brief, but we're going to talk about a little bit of history, and the classifications will be covered there as well. But just to point out real quick, you can see the X height on this, how tall the lowercase letters are. They're pretty small, but as you go forward, they get taller and taller. So X height is something you really need to decide early on, because it's really going to decide a lot of the character of your font. And there are pros and cons to, the X height that you choose, and there are different things that you're going to have to adjust, whether you have a short X height or a tall X height. You can see here the ascenders are going above the cap height, so the height of this capital letter. In this case, with the lower X height, the ascenders just basically stop at the cap height. And this one with the large, this is Mrs. Eves, and this is Mrs. Eves Roman, and this is Mrs. Eves XL. So this one's just got a higher X height on it. And they've had to push up the ascenders above the cap line, because otherwise they would just be really short, and then the D would, well, it wouldn't look like the A, but you get what I'm saying. This here, I think, is a good reminder, the aperture section. This is a good reminder that everything is designed in context. So there are times when the aperture, this little opening here, is called the aperture, where the aperture needs to be bigger. When you're reading something at tiny little body copy or caption sized text, more open apertures are going to be easier to read. But if you got a giant billboard, New Haas Grotesque, is going to be fine, even though it has very small apertures. But you can imagine if this lowercase c was very, very small, it might almost look just like an O, because you wouldn't necessarily distinguish that, especially compared to Frutiger. I know I'm kind of pointing out every page. We'll go a little bit faster here in a second, but this is kind of a front-loaded book. And also this is, I think it's important to point out things so you kind of really know what you're getting into. This is when you start to realize that typography is not just an art. It's very much, you're going to start to see some numbers, you're going to start to see some math, and it very much is a marriage between science and art. I know that's kind of a cliche. Maybe we could say mathematics and vibes, but you've got a lot of numbers, and these are not going to stop. These are going to be present throughout the entire book. So understand that you can't just be all vibes and you can't just be all math. Neither one's going to work. You really need to get comfortable with using both to create a good typeface. And this is probably one of the most important things in the entire book, optical illusions. You are constantly going to be reminded that letters need to overshoot the cap height, or they need to undershoot the baseline, or a circle, you can see here, a circle that is exactly the same height as a square looks smaller. A triangle that is exactly the same height as a square looks smaller. So the triangle has to slightly overshoot the top, and a circle has to slightly overshoot and undershoot the top and bottom in order to appear the same size. And these triangles, squares, and circles are important because that's basically what we're looking at when we're looking at letters. So the O is going to need to overshoot and undershoot. Otherwise, it's going to look too small compared to an N. And an A, here you've got the overshoot here. You could chop off the top there, and that's what they've done here with Avenir Next. But in a lot of cases, especially if you have a point like that, you're going to need to overshoot a little bit. So again, not all vibes, but if you were only looking at the math, you would think, okay, just make it all the same height, right? Like it's 12 point, it's 12 point everywhere. Like, or it's, I don't know, let's do it digital. Let's say it's 24 pixels, it's going to be 24 pixels everywhere. You know, just snap it to the guides. No, because optically, mathematically, that's right, but optically, when we see it, it's not going to look right. So I do think it's worth pointing out because that's going to be like just a huge portion of this book comes down to spacing and balance and optical illusions. So whether that's spacing your letters apart, making sure your apertures are big enough to like have space inside there, the color of the typeface so that it's all going to read nicely, or making defeating all of these optical illusions, overcoming all these optical illusions, and we'll get into those a lot more. But I need to point out, so you know you're getting in for, it's a lot of math, it's a lot of art, and it's a lot of preventing optical illusions. Chapter 3, spacing. So the first page on this is very appropriate because I'm not going to go through the whole story, but basically you're seeing a comparison between Microsoft Sans and Verdana. I'm not sure if it's Verdana or Verdana. I've seen this font so many times and I've never actually said it out loud. I'm going to call it Verdana. But these two typefaces were essentially the same. And what happened was Verdana was so much easier to read and people couldn't necessarily figure out why in the beginning, according to the author. But essentially, you can see these red letters here are the only differences. You know, there's the T, F, and R were a little bit wider, and then I think there was a little bit wider of an X here. But essentially, the difference was in the apertures, was in this spacing. So, like I said before, everything's about context. But on low resolution screens in the early days of PCs and the internet, Verdana was so much easier to read because it had those larger apertures. Here we're looking at you know, spacing with with different uneven spacing here, uneven space in between all letters. Basically showing like how it's easier and more difficult to read a typeface if the spacing is well done versus not being well done. There's a great Adrian Frutiger quote in here somewhere, and basically he says like spacing is good spacing should be imperceptible. Gosh, I wish I'll paraphrase something about, oh, here it is. If you remember the shape of your spoon from lunch, it's the wrong shape. I thought that was such a great thing because when you use a spoon, you just don't think about it. You use a spoon and later on you've completely forgotten about that spoon. But if you remember the spoon, then it was the wrong shape. Spacing here should just be imperceptible. It should be so well done that no one ever notices it. And that's basically the goal. You know, you don't want to be thinking about your spoon from lunch later on because that means it was the wrong shape. Gosh, this is basically the only moment in the entire book where I've just felt like so confused and so lost. I do think that this makes sense with a little bit more context, but when you're looking at this for the first time, it just feels so overwhelming because you're just looking at all these numbers next to the letters and things like that. It's talking about side bearing, the little bit of space that's on each side of a letter. I just think that there had to have been a better way to showcase this. But luckily, you don't necessarily need to understand this 100% in the beginning. It's just kind of something to look at and understand that you're going to need to set your side bearings on all of your letters and then kind of move on. So don't let this discourage you. I will say that this chapter in general is probably the most discouraging in the book, just because you realize that designing a font is not just the fun part. It's not just designing each one of these little characters, each one of these glyphs. There's all of the spacing, and it's a very iterative process where you're constantly sticking words together and seeing how the letters work together constantly throughout the entire thing. You're doing that. So if you can't afford to hire someone else to do that, then you're going to be doing it yourself. I think most people are going to be doing the vast majority of that work themselves. And so it's not just about making nice letters, I guess, unless you only want to design display fonts that need constant kerning and things like that. If you want to make a really good production font, it's a very tedious process. And I think that goes back to the beginning when I said, like, you need a good motivation. You need to understand your motivation, because when you get to this chapter, you might just decide that it's not worth it. I think that it's worth it. I say that as not being a type designer, but I do think that that when you finish this book, you will be motivated to create a typeface. This is the last thing I'll point out in this chapter, but if you've used any design software, or I should say if you've used Adobe design software, because I don't think that I've been using Affinity and it doesn't have an optical version. You can kind of set up your own optical version, but if you use Adobe software, you'll know that the difference between metric and optical, and just the spacing there, you probably can't see it too well on there, but optical is going to have Adobe's algorithm kind of space things out for you, whereas metric is going to be how the designer created the spacing. So if a font is well designed, if a type designer has like gone through and done everything that they should have done, metric should look better than optical, especially at like a body copy, for body copy anyway. Maybe for display, you know, you might want to tighten things up with the tracking and stuff like that. But in general, if a good type designer made your font, then metric is the way that they intended it to be. Chapter 4, uppercase. Now is when we really get into the fun part. You know, there are a lot of things we have to understand before we jump into this. And the last sort of like thing to think about is proportions. So there are basically two, I'll say, like general proportions. There are the classic proportions, and you can see them here, and there are modern proportions. So classic proportions are what the Romans had on their columns. So when we look at Trajan, this is Trajan regular, Trajan capitals. The Romans had, like much of Greece and Rome, ancient Greece and Rome, they had these proportions that were like the perfect proportions. And so you've got root 5 for the width of the E, or for the size of the E. You've got a square for the O. So it's just a perfect square, the O. And you've got 2 root 5s make up the N. 2 golden rectangles make up the A, which I think, yeah, okay, 2 golden rectangles. Then you've got 2 half squares making up the S, 2 half squares making up the X. I think she's kind of fudged that one a little. But, so you can see the vast difference between this E and this O, right? Fast forward to modern times, that creates kind of like a very heavy spot here and a very open spot there. So type designers started to create things in what are referred to as modern proportions, where letters are much more proportional in terms of the color of the text. So when you look at this, everything's kind of like a gray color. If we look at this block of text here, everything is basically like a solid, you know, pretty gray color, and maybe like a little bit of darker color here. But you look at this, you've kind of got a dark spot, a very light spot, and then it kind of gets darker again, and these letters are tighter. When you look at text like this, or this, maybe this row here is even better, everything's pretty much the same color, maybe with the exception of the U. But it is important, this is something you're going to have to decide when you're creating a typeface, whether you're going to follow classic proportions, modern proportions, or, you know, some other crazy proportion of your own design. But you're going to need to know the proportions before you start designing letters, especially capital letters. Our first one, capital O. So this is the first time that you're going to see the biggest difference between the first edition and the second edition. And that is that sans serif and serif, I know there are no serifs here. Let me just flip it forward real quick. Sans serif and serif are included together in the book. And that might seem like, okay, who cares? Like, what's the big deal? The first edition was not like that. The first edition, she created the entire serif alphabet, and then, the book was divided in half, and then this half back here was all sans serif. I think that this is an incredible quality of life change that almost warrants purchasing the second edition, even if you own the first edition, because it gives you the ability to kind of like look at the relationship between the two, because, sans serifs developed from the serif typefaces, but also in order to be able to look at them in terms of a pair, because a lot of times none of these pair together, but a lot of times you're going to have a serif typeface like this paired with a sans serif like that. So if you're really looking at proportions and you're looking at contrast and you're looking at all of these different things, it's great to be able to see how they are designed compared to each other. You're going to see a little bit, I mentioned the optical illusions earlier. They are constant throughout the entire book. But here you get the first like very specific one, the bone effect. And so basically what you're looking at here is that if you just use two circles and you don't adjust the edges, then you kind of get this thing where a letter, it looks like a bone. So if you just stack two circles onto each other, there's this optical illusion that in the middle, it starts to push in. So what you have to do is kind of like add a little bit on the outside and then curve that top circle a little bit more to get a more pleasant proportion. The thing is, of course, you don't have to follow that rule. It's going to be more pleasant, but if you want to break the rule, then you could have, you could add character to your typeface like that. But I think in general, especially if you're a beginner and you're reading this book, just follow the directions. Break the rules later once you better understand them. So the first two letters that we're looking at are the O and the E. I think she mentions that there might be, I don't remember what she said, there's another letter that you could start with instead, but these are the two that she recommends starting with because you're going to get your circle and your square out of the way right off the bat, and then everything else kind of builds from these two. Like I said, the order of the letters is very intentional. So we made the O, we made the E. The E, you're looking at the O in terms of your cap height and your baseline and things like that. And you're going to have to overshoot your O a little bit, like we talked about before, to overcome that. At this point, you're choosing your style of serifs, or if you're doing a sans serif, you're choosing your style of sans serifs. Maybe you're going to cut them off. Maybe you're going to round them. You're doing all of that. And as you go on, the E is going to match the serifs on the H. It's going to basically be similar to the L. But throughout the entire book, like I said, you're battling these optical illusions. There are all these intricacies that, like, if you've never designed a typeface or if you've never read a book about designing a typeface, you wouldn't recognize these unless maybe you'd taken the letters in Adobe Illustrator and aligned them one over the other to look and see how well they line up. But you can see here, this L actually pushes out a little bit more than the E, and the crossbar on the F is a little bit lower than the E. And there's a lot of reasons why these things are happening. On this one here, that bottom line is shorter than the E. But basically, to give a quick explanation, let's just look at the F and the E. The F is a little bit lower than the E because it needs to fill out that space going this way, whereas the E needs to be in the middle or slightly above the middle, so that it can balance the space between the top and the bottom. The L, maybe you don't want the L to be quite as long, so you can see the L is a little bit skinnier in terms of the overall width than the E, because otherwise you get all that empty space and you're going to have a hard time spacing letters out from each other. So the L is always going to have a little bit of space between those, but if you get an L next to an A, then you've got a big gap. So if that bottom line there is a little bit narrower, it's going to fit better together. And she goes through all of that in the book in much better detail and much more professionally than I can. But here, we're going to start seeing our first spacing and testing, unless I missed one. But you're going to see this a lot of times. After you design a group of characters, you're going to start testing them out, and you're going to see how well it spaces, how poorly it spaces, and then you're going to go back and you're going to you're going to adjust letters. Maybe you need to completely redesign something, but probably just adjustments. You're going to need to adjust letters to make sure they fit together, and you're constantly doing this throughout the entire process so that your font is just like it's working as you design each new letter. Here we've got some more testing to do. But you can see we went from the O, and then we made the C, and now we're making the G. And it is important, again, to just point out these. I'll just point them out a few times throughout the rest of the thing. But the C and the G, they're not the same. The G needs to be pushed out a little bit further, and it needs to have, you have to make decisions about what you're going to do with these throats. This piece here is the throat. So the throat on this one is pushed up higher. This one's got a little spur at the bottom. It's got a spur going down. This one's got a bracketed spur. This one's spur on the top. So there's all these tiny details that you need to decide on, especially if you're creating a serif typeface. This one here has no crossbar on the G, and it's nice and open, but is it as distinctive as the G with like a little arrow on it? When I was in school, I actually designed my personal logo as a C on top of an S. I still use it, but I don't really do much personal. I'm not using my personal logo very often anymore, but that's what I did. I stacked my two circles on top of each other. And of course, I didn't resize the bottom one to have better balance. You can see the bottom of the S is wider than the top of the S. And I didn't fix this little kink in there because I was stubborn and I wanted to have two perfect circles. What you should really do is this starts out as two circles that are equal. You make this one, either you make the top one smaller or the bottom one bigger, so that it's got a better base to sit on. Like I said, this is all about balance. So it's not just like balancing one letter to another, it's balancing on this baseline as well, and just kind of making this letter feel like it can actually stand up on its own. So you need a wider base on it. You need the top to be a little bit higher and a little bit smaller than the bottom. And you don't want that kink in there, that optical illusion where two circles hit each other. So you kind of smooth out that portion there. The J is kind of interesting in the sense that I didn't ever know the history of the J. It actually didn't exist. It wasn't like a real letter in the alphabet, at least in the Roman alphabet. It was essentially used as the last letter of a Roman numeral. So she points out here, you probably won't be able to read it, but she's got a 9, she's got a 14. X, I. No, it's 13. X, I. In order for someone to know that it's the last letter, they would curve the I under it. And then that's essentially how the J became into existence. But also Romans didn't use any spaces. Everything was capitals. There was no lowercase. There was no punctuation. They straight up just put like capital letter after capital letter. So if you were reading a number, this would be something very important to understand that that's the last Roman numeral before you start reading other letters that might also be numbers. But you can see, look at all the possibility for designing a different J, all the different characteristics that you can choose, whether it's the terminals or the hooks here. This here, well, these are two different typefaces, but one great thing about modern times with digital typesetting is that you can include open type features. And so you could have an alternate J, one that sits on the baseline, and you could have one sitting below the baseline. Of course, that creates more design work for you, but if you love designing, then you just get to do more of what you love, and then the end user has a more versatile, better typeface. I think it's something we take for granted these days, the ability to have open type, or at least different these types of features and stuff like that, but it's something you need to actually think about as a type designer, and it's something that you'll run into a lot of those things in this book where you're just like, as a graphic designer or a user of typography, you just take them for granted, but as a type designer, you think, oh yeah, now this is my job to figure out how to solve this problem. You can see with these D's and B's, the negative space, the inside of these counters, they can really add a lot of character to a typeface. And I saw a type designer one time, I can't remember who it was, but they posted, like when they first were studying type design, that their instructor told them they needed to be just as worried about the negative space as they were about the positive space. And they were saying, like, I can barely do the positive space. How am I supposed to focus on this too? But you can see how much more, how differently these fonts feel, and a lot of that has to do with how that negative space is shaped. You've got this bottom part of the D here that's bracketed, and it kind of gives it this teardrop shape, whereas the top is not. The top's nice and hard. But then you've got this modern font where both of them are matching. I found the relationship between the Q and the R to be really interesting, because prior to reading this book, I would have never thought, like the G and the C are very easy to like relate together. The B and the R you think would be very easy to relate together. But the R and the Q, like I never would have thought about this. But when you're designing the Q, a lot of times you're looking at how it relates to the R. Like look at the leg of this R, and oh gosh, I can't think of what this is called now. The bottom part. The bottom part of your Q here, many of these are matching. Even the sans, oh, this isn't a sans serif, but even the ones that are like, not these big swashes. This one's just cut off, blunted tip, she calls it. Even these blunted tips, they're matching there. Not all of them are going to match, but this one here, you can see it's got that thin little bar there. This curly Q of a tail. I guess they're both called, oh, this is the tail and this is the leg. So like this leg of the R is matching the tail of the Q. I thought that was really interesting, because that's not something that I ever would have, it's not something that I would have thought. If someone said, what letter are you going to look at when you're designing the Q? The R never would have crossed my mind. But that's why I'm not a professional designer. But also, something to point out is that if everything matches too perfectly, if everything's always exactly the same, your typeface can become kind of monotonous. So it is important to have a little bit of variety too. You want your typefaces to feel cohesive, but you don't want every letter to look exactly like the one next to it. But you can see she's looking at the sans serifs here and how the terminals end. These kind of have like a little bit of a brush stroke, and then these are chopped off at an angle. So yeah, the Q and the R, I never would have guessed. The V and the A though, the V and the A are pretty easy, pretty easy to see the similarities between the two. I will say I feel like there could have been more examples. I know the V and the A are pretty simple glyphs, but I do feel like there could have been a few more examples of these. Maybe that's just me. But I don't have a lot of complaints about this book in general, really. You can see here, more testing to do. You're just constant testing, constant iteration. Design a few letters, test them out. Design a few letters, test them out. And you're gonna have to do that with your numbers, your punctuation, everything. The history of the U is another interesting story, and how it relates to the V. I'll stop bothering you and or stop like telling you all of the stories in the book and just let you look them up. But I found, because this book is such like a user manual for how to design type, you know, it is very technical, despite, you know, it's not super formal in its writing, but it is very technical. I mean, you can look at this page and you can see how technical it is. And I do find that those little stories about how the J became something or how the U became something, they add like a little bit of brevity or a little bit of lightness to the book that, you know, can be quite overwhelming. Here we're looking at the optical illusions again between the X. This is one that I really, really remember in school learning, where if two lines run through each other, especially if there's very high contrast, so if one's very thin and one's very thick, the line can appear broken. So basically what you do is you move this part of the line here, you just kind of move it down in between the thicker one. And so these two lines don't actually technically line up, mathematically line up, but optically we see them as lining up. See, if I go like that, they look like they line up, right? But as a type designer, these are the problems that you're constantly going to need to be solving. The W, I don't know that it's my favorite. I think the capital K is my favorite, but I think the W is the most interesting letter. I think the author says that like the Q and the R, or not the Q and the R, maybe. I think maybe the Q and the R, she said a lot of designers, those are their favorites. But gosh, the W just looks so cool. And there's so many different options, but I love this double V crossing each other. I do think that creates, I mean, she even says that creates a lot of issues in terms of like spacing or letter color, you know, because you're going to have this big dark spot, whereas this is much more balanced. But I just think that looks so cool. I don't know why. One thing I will point out though, is that in the same way that grid systems he would show you like, here's a problem you're going to encounter with grids. She does the same thing with all of these. I know we've been talking about optical illusions and things like that, but constantly she's pointing out, you know, if you have this, you're going to have ink get trapped in here. So what you need to do is taper the letters in. You can see here, you're tapering this in. So constantly she's pointing out, here's the problem you're going to encounter, but here's the solution, or here are potential solutions. You can see here, even they've broken up the thin letter, or the thin line that's going across the thicker line, because that same optical illusion can happen on this W like it does in Bodini. Bodoni, right? Here's my favorite letter, I think. This is my favorite letter. This is such a dumb reason. I really love this little bitty crossbar that connects that one. That's not the reason. The reason the K, capital K, is my favorite letter is because when I was in school, when I was in 3rd grade, this is how I used to write my Ks. My Ks and my Rs, I wrote like that. I would do it like that, and I'd stick the leg out here. I didn't do it like, you know, like Futura. Do we have Futura on here somewhere? No, but we have Le Mans Sands here. I didn't do it like this, you know, where the R comes right out of the middle. I didn't do my K like that with like a little triangle. I loved to write my Ks and my Rs with the leg out here. My 3rd grade teacher would always fight with me, and she'd say, no, that's not the right way to do it. You have to put it, you know, like a triangle. So if I ever design a typeface, I am going to make my K like this, make my R like this, and I'll give my 3rd grade teacher a free copy of the font. But I think the last thing I'll say about this chapter is just I'm constantly struck by just the subtleties of the type design, just all of the little things that you need to do, and it's what you'll start to see as you go through this book. We're finishing up the capitals right now. We're going to go on to the lowercase. But just all these tiny little choices, like what you're going to do with this connection, like I was just talking about with the K, but all of the little things that you need to do, because she's comparing the R and the K and the stroked width. So these are both 27 width, but then this is tapering from 23 down to 22, back out to 26. Like, you would look at this and maybe not fully think that it's like a mono width letter, or even this one. You can look at this K right here. This basically looks mono width, right? Like, it looks like someone just took a pen and went like this. But this is 24, this is 24 that kind of flares out. This bar here is 22 that's tapering in. These tiny little things, these subtleties that make a typeface look great, it takes a lot of effort. The sprezzatura is real. Like, they make it look easy to look this good, but it is a lot of work. Chapter 5, lowercase. So, like I said, you do have to go in order because you need the uppercase first to be able to create your lowercase. But one thing that she points out in the very beginning is lowercase proportions. So you're going to start to see these boxes. There's a box inside of a box here. These are very useful. Eventually, you'll just kind of glance at them and you'll understand whatever you're looking at. But in the beginning, you might like consciously inspect them a bit more. And specifically, when you're designing your typeface, you're going to want to look at these and get some proportions, or at least some ideas about what to do with your proportions. But she makes the point here that lowercase letters didn't exist in classic proportions. The Romans, like I said, only used capital letters. So these lowercase letters, even if the uppercase are classic proportions, the lowercase don't have a classic proportion. So they all kind of look the same, whether it's modern or classic. They all kind of have the same proportion. And that is not just shrinking down the uppercase. So you can't just shrink the uppercase O and it'll be the same as the lowercase o. Well, this is a bad example because you kind of can here. But the uppercase V, it's much more narrow than the lowercase v because you still need to fill out that space. If you just shrunk that down, the V would be too narrow. You'd get ink in the gaps and things like that. It just wouldn't be as legible, and the color of the typeface wouldn't be as nice when you're reading. But I will point out, this isn't necessarily about this page specifically, but the typefaces, the fonts in this book are amazing. Like, I'll just read these out real quick. ITC Galliard, Bauer Bodoni, Abril Display, Clarendon Text, Cuesta Slab, Quadrat Sans. You see a lot of these typefaces over and over and over, and I kind of feel Helvetica New, Swift. You see them over and over, and even if they weren't typefaces that you were familiar with before, you become intimately familiar with them through the course of reading this book because you're constantly looking at the letters in such detail, and you really, really appreciate how well designed they are. And I'll say this. If you're someone that's getting fonts from defont.com, or you're downloading free fonts off Instagram or something, or from Instagram display fonts and things like that, I think you're gonna have a hard time doing that after you see the quality and craftsmanship of the typefaces that are in this. So I think that it's really great, the fonts that she's chosen to include in the book. And actually, I'll go ahead and give you a preview. One of the appendixes in here, Appendix 3 maybe, has all of the fonts. All the typefaces. No, 3 is further reading. Appendix 4 has every typeface and on all of their foundries that are in the book. But you really do become very familiar with these, and you're just going to appreciate them so much more. Particularly, I came to appreciate modern Didone typefaces so much more. Like, they're not practical for reading in body copy or anything like that. But gosh, they're beautiful, and I just really do feel like they're the perfect designs. I know they're not perfect because you couldn't do this all in, what's this, Ambroise? Let's just say Dido. You couldn't do all of this in Dido or Bodoni, but man, they look beautiful like that, don't they? She talks a little bit here about humanist versus rationalist construction. So humanist is going to be like created by a human. I mean, it's pretty easy to think about, but you're looking at how these letters would have been made classically, with calligraphy or with a chisel or something like that. And then you're thinking about how you would design the typeface based on that. Rational, so with the humanist, you've kind of got this stress going this way. So actually, none of these do have that stress. Let me see real quick. All of these are up and down. Okay, this kind of has the stress going this way. So you've got that stress going that way. That would be a humanist design. Whereas the rational is going to be like Futura, where you're just having, or Futura, or the modern typefaces, where you have more of like a perfect circle, where the font is just going straight up and down, the stress of the font. But yeah, that's something to think about when you're designing any of these typefaces, is that like all modern typefaces essentially came from calligraphy or some special use case. Like if we're thinking about like the old Bell, oh gosh, I can't think of what it's called now, but the typeface that were used in the Bell phone books, I know it's Bell something. It had the little ink traps built into it. I think the Wall Street Journal did that as well. And right now we're seeing a lot of display fonts that have these giant ink traps in it. Those ink traps were created for a reason, and now they're being used kind of like as an aesthetic, but it's still important, even when they're designing those, that they're not just sticking ink traps everywhere, wherever they want, right? That doesn't make sense. You still always come back to like, what is the purpose? Why were these designed the way that they were? And for these humanist fonts, you really want to think about how the human's hand would have made it, so you know where to place the stress, where you know where to have your contrast at, and things like that. So even though we're doing all of this digitally now, thinking about how things would have been made can still be very important. Here again, she's kind of talking about giving you some problems that you might come across and the solutions for them. In this case, when she's talking about the rational construction, you can't just stick an O on the outside of an L and think it's going to work. So what she does is she pushes, what designers do is they push the O into the stem there, and they can either cut it off and have like a flat counter on the inside, or they can actually dig into the stem. Do any of these dig into the stem? I don't think any of these do. Oh yeah, the P here. So you can see this would go straight down, and the Q too, but it's kind of digging into the stem there, unless I'm optically seeing that wrong. Anyway, like I said, she gives you lots of problems and how to solve them immediately. There's much like grid systems, you're not going to leave this book with a lot of questions. Well, I take that back. You're going to have a lot of questions, but you're not going to have she's not going to present problems to you and then be like, go figure it out. She's going to present problems to you and then say, here's how to fix it. So you'll still have many, many questions, but I do think she does a good job of solving all the problems that she presents. And here's an example of what I was saying before, where all of these typefaces, or at least a bunch of these, are preventing the boning. Aglet Slab here goes ahead and just says like, F it, let's have the boning. And it does give it like a certain, a unique characteristic. I think it mainly works because everyone else optically prevents that problem from happening. So when they do it, when a type designer does that, it can feel, unique and interesting, even though, it might not necessarily always be the most visually appealing. You can see here how, let's go ahead and compare these. Like I said before, you want things to feel cohesive. So you want the cuts, all these cuts are flats. The U is basically just a flipped in, or vice versa. You want them to feel cohesive. And so here, when you're thinning that out, the H and the M, they're kind of tapering that in. They're pretty much similar, or pretty much exactly the same almost. But this feels a little monotonous, right? So that can be great from a utilitarian standpoint, from like a very consistent standpoint, but having a little bit of variety in your endings, like the H is a little bit different here, but the H matches the U, the N and the M match each other. Those kind of things can add a little bit of variety to it, that can make your typeface feel like a little more lively. And the same thing can be said for sans serifs. You can do a sans serif, like, let's see if Helvetica is on here somewhere. Okay, here's a good example. I don't want to skip this. Let you look at the lowercase r a little bit of testing here. But here we've got Helvetica New, and everything is chopped off horizontally, right? And that's cool. The R is not horizontally, but everything's just chopped off straight, and it looks like it all belongs together. But let's look at something else here. Let's see. Maybe we'll go back to the serifs. I'm sure there's a good example here. Oh, here's one. So if we look at the S doesn't have like ball terminals inside of the uppercase, but it does on the lowercase. They're not real ball terminals, so I guess there's more like teardrops. But you can kind of, these two look like they go together, but they don't have to match exactly, whereas Archer matches exactly. So there are little things like that you can do. Oh, here's a better example. There are little things like this where you can have these ball terminals on the end of these, but then have these sharp spurred serifs, spurred serifs on the S's. And the typeface, it still all belongs together. This one still all looks like it belongs together, but it doesn't have to be exactly the same. And she talks about that much more concisely and professionally than I am. But like I said, I think it's cool to point these things out so that you're well aware of what you're getting into. And this is a book review after all. A very, very in-depth flip through book review. I thought this was one of the coolest things, and she doesn't even have the S on here, but like not every A, obviously. But look at this right here. Is this Helvetica or is this Neuhaus Grotesque? So basically, Neuhaus Grotesque, Accents, Grotesque, Helvetica, they're all kind of the same. But look at this A. I've never realized that the A is very, very similar to the lowercase s. I mean, only the two-story A, of course. This one's not. But isn't that interesting? There are a bunch of these things in this book that, gosh, you just never notice until you really are analyzing the typography in detail. I think the lowercase g is one of the biggest opportunities to put some character into your typeface, because there are just so many pieces to it. There are basically like 4 pieces to this typeface. You get the little ear, the bowl. I don't know what this is called. Did we have it on here? Okay, so here it is. You've got the ear, you've got your bowl, you've got your link, this piece in the middle, and then you've got your loop or your tail. And you can do something different for each part of this. Obviously, you want to match the rest of your typeface, but there's just a lot of opportunity in the G to make something really cool, especially in the serifs. When you come to the sans serifs, you still have some of those opportunities, but if you're creating like a really rational font, you're probably going to do something pretty simple. More testing, always more testing. I think this is really interesting too. We talked about the X height before, but the X height's going to determine, the X height's going to determine things like where the tittles, the dots of the I and J are going to be placed. So, some of these are below the cap height, some of them cross it, some of them stop right at it. Some of them stop at the height of the ascenders. And then you've got all the shapes that you can do too. You can put circle ones, or you can put square ones, or you could do little diamonds. This one looks like a little brush stroke. There are just so many places that you get to make decisions. I think as designers, like having rules, but then within those rules, having space to make decisions is what makes being a designer fun. I do appreciate that the ligatures were added like immediately right here, because it could have easily been in an appendix and at the end and just been like, hey, create your F, create your I, create your L, and then like later on be like, here's how you stick them together. But instead, she's got some common ligatures here, which is going to be like the FF, the FI, and it's really cool, the FL. This one is, I mean, someone can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. I can't think of a single word that goes FFJ. Like this ligature looks cool. And I was sitting here being like, man, that's a cool ligature. And then I was thinking like, when are you ever using a word that's FFJ? I don't know, like FFL, waffle. FFJ? What word goes FFJ? It looks cool though. Oh, more K's. I love the lowercase k just as much as the uppercase K. Yeah, I never have noticed these little crossbars on K's before, but gosh, I can't unsee them now, and I really appreciate them. I might have to eat my words about how I designed my typeface because I really like that little crossbar there. Maybe I'll do an open face and an open type, and I'll do alternates where one of them is sticking it to my third grade teacher and one is sticking in that little crossbar. Again, you can see all of the subtle details here. This is called FF Real Head, the book weight. But all of these different weights, this K has a 23 for the 23 point stroke there, but then it's going from 21 tapering down to a 20, and it's going from 22 to 22 here. But what she does throughout this lowercase section, I probably should have pointed this out earlier, but she relates a lot of percentages. There are a lot of spaces where there's percentages. You can kind of ignore them first pass until you're like really designing. But what she does is she relate the weights here. So like this stroke is a 23 in the capital, but in the lowercase it's a 22. And then this is tapering from a 21 down to a 20, but the lowercase tapers from a 19 down to an 18. And I think that that's very, very useful, particularly for new designers. But it would just be useful when you got to this section and you're like, oh gosh, like you design it with the exact same weight and then the lowercase feels too heavy. Oh. I'm not sure how well you can see it here. Probably not very well. But once you see this in a super bold, what is this? Ziggurat black. When you have like a super heavy or like a black typeface weight, these Clarendon, they create these little arrows. I'm trying to get the words out of my mouth here. They create these little arrows. And like I said before, the negative space is just as important. I don't think I could ever do a typeface like this because those little arrows would drive me crazy, like where they're pointing, what they're pointing at. Yeah, so if you needed arrows in a logo or something like that, I think that could be a really cool way to do it. But that's an interesting problem that you're either going to have to embrace or overcome, because every X with a serifs is going to create, has the potential to create some of these arrows in here, but when you've got them bracketed, it kind of smooths that out. When the counters are pretty open, it smooths all that out. But we've got this really bold, these really heavy slab serifs on there. You're not going to be able to get rid of those arrows and the heavy weights. Here you can see a little bit more of these boxes that I was talking about, where she's really doing a great job of comparing how the lowercase z and x compares to the uppercase, so you can get the proportions, visually ideal. This is not necessarily the right way to do it, but what she does is she's showing you 6 different fonts here: Universe, Walbaum, Swift, Quadrat Sans, and then she's showing you how these typefaces created their proportions for the uppercase and lowercase. So it's not this is the way to do it, it's this as how other professional type designers and some of the best fonts in the world solve this problem before you. Chapter 6, Numbers. A constant situation that I found myself in, and you might be finding yourself in this just listening to me right now, but a situation that I found myself in when I was reading this book was just constant information overload. And it's important to point out this book is not meant to be read cover to cover. I do think the first time you read the book, maybe read it cover to cover before you actually start designing a typeface. Maybe you could do some little sketches and stuff like that along the way. But I wouldn't try to just, I don't know. The reason I'm saying this is because when I read the first edition, I didn't actually finish doing a typeface. I didn't finish doing any of it because I was designing as I went along. I used it as a workbook, and I started designing the O, then I designed the E. And I didn't even make it through the capital letters because I didn't fully understand what I was in for. And that's why I think this review and the flip through and just really showing you what you're in for, and this is only, a small portion of it. It's important, I think, to understand the cohesiveness or understand this completely. So I do think it's important to read cover to cover, but just don't think that you're going to sit down and read this cover to cover, because it would be like sitting down and reading a user manual for Photoshop or Blender or something. It's very informative, and the writing is somewhat conversational, but it has to be technical to teach you how to do this the right way. So what I suggest is understand that this is going to take you, I don't know, maybe spread it out over a month or something and read something else at the same time. But sit down and read a few letters and take a break, because what's going to happen is your brain just gets completely saturated with information and it can't absorb anything more. And the reason I point that out is because I specifically remember when I got to this chapter, I had taken a break. After lowercase, I had taken a break. I got to the numbers, and I was like, oh man, this is so refreshing to read. I had this new energy when I started reading it again, and I realized oh yeah, this isn't a narrative fiction book that you're just supposed to consume. You're not supposed to binge read this book. So I think if you're getting frustrated or you're feeling overwhelmed or you're feeling my brain is just too saturated, I've taken in too much stuff right now, take a break, go do something else, come back, and it will feel so much more enjoyable to read this. And then later, you'll just use the book as a reference. But I do think it's important to read it from beginning to end before you start designing. But I don't think that it's a good idea to read this just beginning to end in a day or 2 days or maybe even a week, depending on how much time you have. But it's worth reading, but just understand what you're in for. Numbers. I think I'm just going to point this out. I think I am in the minority because I love, what are we calling these? Lining figures. I love uppercase numbers. Lowercase numbers, I don't know. I'm just not a huge fan of. I understand why they exist, but in using Silvertype, my objectives font, I am constantly running into issues trying to use the lining numbers. I do think something like this is nice, where they kind of compromise, and she's calling them hybrid figures. Other people hate the hybrid figures because they think it's not, it needs to make a decision. I don't know. But you can always, if you have a good typeface that has both, you can always switch to the other one. So I'm not complaining. I love having the choices. And within text like this, these what would you call these? These the old style figures, they look nice in these bodies of text. Whereas, the lining figures, or the tabular figures, they're going to stick out like a sore thumb. But I'm not often writing books. I'm writing a headline or something, and this is what comes up by default, and then I have to change it all the time. One thing, just before I go, I know I'm on this page for a long time. She points out here something that I've never heard before, and that's that the term Arabic, we refer to these as Arabic numerals, as opposed to Roman numerals, which were just the letters of the alphabet that we were using as numbers as well. These weren't actually Arabic. They she points out the history here, and I might mess it up, but basically there were merchants that were coming to Europe that were Arabic, and they were using these numbers, so they were called Arabic numbers, but the numbers were actually from India. So she refers to them as Hindu Arabic to be, I don't know, to more precisely reference the origin, but I don't think that's going to catch on. But it's an interesting bit of history. This is definitely one of the biggest problems for, for a sans serif typeface is designing these ones and zeros, because the one, the zero, here you've got it right here, like the one, the zero, the O, the L, the capital I. In a sans serif typeface like Helvetica, they all kind of look the same. Here's another one of those things that before I said like the two-story lowercase a, I never realized how much it looked like the S. Like, how have I gone my whole life? Whenever I think of the S, I think of the S and the 5. I guess maybe because of old school pixel fonts and things like that. But like the S and the 5 could kind of look the same, especially if you're doing a very blocky font. But the S and the 2, look how similar they are. And maybe you're just like, duh, Curtis. But I never realized, when you were designing the 2, like, of course you would look at the S to see, like, how can I make this feel cohesive? With like Mallory here, they look very similar. Then you come to something like Baskerville Display, and you're adding a little bit more variety in there, but you're still looking at some of the stroke widths and things like that. I don't know. I just thought it was really interesting, especially in some of these sans serifs, how similar the S and the 2 are. Oh, wait. This is something else. Like I said, the little arrows, you'll be able to see this one for sure on screen. The little arrows in those other ones are something I'll never unsee. I will never unsee the flag on top of the 5 again in my life. Like, of course, when you've got like a sans serif, there's no flag there, but it's still called a flag. But look at this little flag on top of the 5. Like, how cute is that? But also, what? Like, it really is like a little flag on top. I think that's a really cool place that you could add some personality. Like, what do you want the flag on top of your 5 to look like? I love that, and I'll never unsee it, but I love it. I think the 7s are my favorite. I don't know if they're my favorite number, but I looked at a lot of them when I was designing. For another project, I was looking at a lot of 7s on slot machine reels, and the 7s that are on slot machines are just so exaggerated and so cool, and they have to fit into these like very specific spaces. And when you have a 777, it needs to fit into more space. So I was really interested in to see how the 7s were solved on there. But it's really cool to see, how a 7 is actually designed within a larger typeface, and then compare that to how 7s were, how they solved that problem on a slot machine. The 8 has the same issue as the S. You could just put your 2 circles on top of each other, but it's going to look top heavy, and you have to have the bigger base on it so that it can sit on the baseline. So the bottom part has to be a little bit bigger, a little bit taller, and then the top bowl needs to be a little bit smaller. She points out here that the X can have, or the 8 can have the same issue as the X, where you're getting that cross and the lines look broken. And then she points out how some typefaces, like this one here, intentionally make the break more exaggerated. And I think that comes back to the negative space again, where you can really create interesting shapes. Look at this one. She says that this one here is kind of rare, I think, but where the waist is just pinched perfectly closed like that. But yeah, with the negative space in the 8, I feel like is an opportunity to add some character. We are coming very close to the end here. Chapter 7, Punctuation. I will say this is the most fun chapter to read because it's so recent that we understand the history of all these forms. You know, there is written history during the time of them being invented. Who knows why the early letters were invented, how they came to be in ancient times, but we know how this stuff was invented, and it's really cool to learn about the history of how they came to be, what other, systems existed, and what came into style, what came out of style. It's really cool. This is definitely my favorite chapter. I do think punctuation also is like it's a good opportunity for a little bit more character. She's pointing out here, she's pointing out some of the sizing differences in between like the dots and the punctuation, but she's also pointing out that, you probably want to stay consistent. If the dots to your eyes were square, you probably want to make your periods square. I think there are some of them here that break the rules, not necessarily break the rules, but they're using slab serifs here, but then they're using dots for this. I'm sure there are some of them that use dots and squares at the same time, but there's a lot of interesting choices that you can make here, as with all of this. But I do feel like the punctuation is a very specific place where you can be more expressive. And speaking of expressive, I never knew the history of the question and exclamation marks. Basically, the question mark was a Q, a capital Q above a lowercase o, and then the exclamation was a capital I above a lowercase o, and then they just turned into this. They both came from Latin, I think. So it says quaestio was QO, so quaestio, that would make sense. And then joy was IO. I'm not sure how to say that. EO, so IO. So you've got to ask, and you've got joy. Now we use exclamations for basically screaming, but we still use that joy, right? And when we're texting people, we want someone to know that, like, hey, we're not mad, haha, like, I'm happy. We use a little exclamation point, and it goes all the way back to the original invention of it, which was a capital I and a lowercase o that became that. I do think this is one of those places where you're going to start to realize whether you have a high quality font or not. Because a high quality font, a well-designed font, is going to have proper dashes, proper hyphens, in dashes, and m dashes. And then, there are different ways to do this here, but technically, I think that the m dash should probably cover an m space, and n dash should cover an n space, and then the hyphen, should just be a smaller version. But now there are people that will put the spacing, a little bit of, what was it called, side bearing? They'll put a little bit of spacing on the sides of them. I can see both arguments for it, but classically, this is what it should be. An m dash should take up the space of an M. But what I was talking about with the high quality and low quality font, like if you're grabbing something off the font, you're not going to have a dash that can line up with a capital and also a lowercase. So this is Irma text 83 point. Irma text here has two different hyphens. These are both hyphens. This is the uppercase hyphen that's going to adjust based on, open type. It's going to see here's an uppercase number and here's an uppercase letter. And it's going to put the hyphen higher as opposed to in lowercase. So you've got the hyphen here that fits better into lowercase, whereas this one's in uppercase. If you have a font that's, a font designer that doesn't care about these little details, your hyphen is going to feel really low or really high depending on where they stuck it. This one here, this is usual in 88 point. They've got two different ones there as well. I will say, when you're learning about design, there's this gap that happens where your taste in design becomes better than your skill in design. So you're like better at understanding what good design is before you can actually create good design. And there's a bit of frustration that happens there. I think that you're going to be void of that frustration. If you're trying to actually design a typeface, yes, you're going to have that frustration. But what can cool the burn a little bit is the idea that even though you can't design a typeface as well as your taste is for it, you can still pick out better typefaces. You can still use typography in a better way because you understand what a good typeface should look like. If you're looking and you're looking at a font and you want to see if it has the open type feature of an uppercase and a lowercase hyphen, that immediately improves your ability to design better, even if you're not a better type designer, just by having that better taste. So I think even if you're never going to design a font, reading this book is going to help you use typefaces, use typography better, be a better typographer, a better graphic designer. I'll get off my soapbox and point out how cool the @ symbol is. I'll spare you the history by the book if you want to read it. But the history is kind of cool, even if it's a little ambiguous. But all of the different options for how to create your @ symbol, I think the classic, stick it in the middle, put a big circle around it, is the most recognizable, the most legible. When you get into something like this, like, I guess in context, you're going to understand what it is. Like, I have no problem understanding that. But this one that comes out of the bowl, like, that's really fun. I think that one might be a little less recognizable. Like I said, in context, you're going to be seeing an email. You're going to understand what it is. But it is really cool, and it's a great opportunity, again, to put a little bit of something unique into your font. And it's really cool to see all these different ways that people have solved this problem. I would imagine, I think they didn't do it here, but I was going to say, I would imagine you could have an open type feature where you have an alternate, where you have like the single story A, and then you could also have like a 2-story A and let people choose which version they wanted. Oh wait, shut up, this one has it. Fact has 2 variations on the A and the A. Okay, so you could change both the A and the @ symbol. Yeah, so a perfect example. And they both look great. The pound sign, another history lesson, but the pound sign was LB, for like a pound, Libra Pondo, Pondo, I don't know how to say it, but it used to be LB, how we say pound in America or Britain or whoever else uses the pound for measurements instead of kilograms. But then they would put a line through the top of it. So imagine L, B in lowercase, and then a line through the ascenders, and that essentially became the pound sign. It's pretty cool, right? Gosh, everyone loves an ampersand, right? I remember when I was a kid, the ampersand and the GE, the General Electric logos, I think that probably because they look the same, the E and the GE kind of looks like this. But the ampersand and the GE logos, like, I remember just being obsessed. Like, I could just stare at them for probably not hours, but like every time I would see them, I would just stare at them. And it seemed like some kind of magical thing. And I think that that's something interesting about, let me go ahead and stay on this since I'm going to talk for a second. I think that's one interesting thing when you're looking at the typefaces, when you're looking at designing these, is to think about the fact that some of these letters were designed thousands of years ago. These came from ancient Rome. And we're carrying on this tradition of like writing down these runes that only we can read. And I don't know, there is some like visceral feeling, this like connection to the past. Like, if you design a typeface, you're carrying on this tradition from thousands of years ago. And if you choose to do it in classic proportions, you're carrying on even more of the tradition. You're carrying forward those proportions. I don't know, it's a really cool thing, I think. Chapter 8 Diacritical marks. Diacritical marks, I'm pretty sure I probably just skimmed over this chapter the first time I read the book. The first edition anyway. I fully read this book, as you can probably note by how long this video is. But diacritical marks aren't something that I ever really had to deal with too much. I studied Spanish in high school. I lived in Las Vegas for 14 years, so I came across quite a bit of Spanish, but I didn't ever use these. I didn't need them. You know, a few times I would have to go to the glyphs in Illustrator and put them in there for an E or something like that. But now that I live in Brazil, these are much more important to me. I'm reading Portuguese and I'm needing to speak Portuguese daily, and I understand what they mean now, and I know where to place my emphasis and how to say letters and stuff. So if you're a type designer, if you're going to design a typeface for anyone that speaks something other than English, pay attention to these. They matter. And I won't say that I feel entirely confident when it comes to creating these myself. After reading this chapter, I don't know that, I won't say that this section is incomplete, but you can see how brief it is. It's not like, they're simple marks, you know, it's similar to punctuation, but there are intricacies to these that that even go culturally, from like one culture that uses the same symbol to another one, and there are certain symbols that can look like symbols that they aren't. I think you'd really need to probably need to get some outside help or really study up well to understand how to do diacritical marks in a language that's not your native language. I'm stuck on this page because I wanted to point out something fun, and it's that in 18th century Britain, the circumflex, that's this little caret, the circumflex was used as an abbreviation for OUGH. So if you had the word though, like THOUGH, gosh, am I saying this right? THOUGH, you could abbreviate it THO and then put the little circumflex on top of it. Or you could spell the word bought, like I bought a new iPhone last week. You could do BRO and put the circumflex on top of it. Clearly that didn't catch on. I write though all the time when I'm texting, THO. But maybe I should start using the little, maybe I should start using the little circumflex just to be more of a nerd. Umlauts. There's a history lesson in here somewhere. I'll let you read that one. Anybody that learns Spanish, if you're an English speaker and you learn Spanish, you're very familiar with this tilde. Is it tilde or tilde? I've always called it a tilde, but I'm not actually sure. But she talks about here, you know, this one here has got, what would you call that? It's got very big curves to it, right? But you could have flatter curves. The problem is, like, flatter curves are going to fit better within the height of your letter, but flatter curves could also be confused for a straight line. These bigger curves here, they're going to be more distinct. You're going to be able to specifically know what that diacritical mark is, but it's going to increase the line spacing that you need. Otherwise, you know, if you have a lowercase y or a q with a big tail on it, it's going to run into a diacritical mark like that. So one more thing to worry about, one more problem to solve, but that's why we're designers, right? To solve problems. This is a symbol that I use that's common in Portuguese. And the first time that I saw this, where it was just a little mark below it, I asked my wife, I was like, that's wrong, right? And she was like, no, sometimes I write it like that. I'm just like, okay, I know nothing. Yeah, more opportunities to add character. I would say if you don't use this, what do they call it? Cedilla? I'm not sure. If you don't use this symbol, this type of C often, I probably wouldn't get too crazy with it. I would probably ask a native speaker and then do whatever they say. This is the German S set, the sharp S. We saw this in the grid systems book, when we were looking at the alphabets, they had the German S on there, obviously, because it was written by a German man. And it was written in German and English side by side. One minor complaint about the book before we go on to the appendices, maybe less of a complaint, more of a slight criticism, is that I would have liked to have seen one full alphabet. We spent the whole book, looking at getting used to all these characters. Like I said, you become very intimate with these typefaces. I would have liked to have seen at least just one complete typeface all laid out together. And unfortunately, we don't get that. We saw a little bit of that in the beginning with the case studies. And I do know that it would have added more pages to this already quite large book. But I think adding just even an appendix that had a full alphabet on it, maybe just do, I don't know, even if it was just one, I would like to see a full alphabet to kind of see all of the work that we put together and then be able to see that in one place. I know you can go online, you can see every glyph of a font together, but I would have liked to see what she had to say about a typeface in kind of a cohesive way, seeing everything at the end and just seeing all the pieces come together, because right now we're really focused on one symbol or two symbols at a time. If I could add anything to this book as a complete novice, complete non-expert in type design, it would be to see a full alphabet based on one of these typefaces, at least that we've been looking at. The dream would be get one from each of these classifications, which is the first appendix here, type classifications. That would be, the real dream, to have one from, Venetian, old style, transitional, modern, slab serif, to have one of each family. I think that's asking quite a bit, though. So even just one typeface to kind of look at and look back at, I think would be a great addition for the third edition of this book when that comes out in 2035 or whenever the next version comes out. But to move on and finish this book up, there are 4 appendices in the book. The first one is type classification. She kind of gives a brief overview of it here, but mostly this talks about how type classification is a bit of a struggle because it's difficult to agree on type classification, and also we're no longer in these time periods, but we are creating these typeface styles. So there have been some attempts to classify typefaces, and I'm sure that you learned them in school and were tested on them. But then you come to typefaces like the ones here, and none of these really fit the classifications because maybe they have pieces of 2 or 3 different classifications and they don't neatly fit into any of these boxes. So I've seen Foundry owners and type designers complain about, a lot of the vibe classifications that are online now, where it's like happy font, scary font. I don't know the answer, but I can't really hate on it because there's not a great way to classify fonts. There's just too many now, and there's too many options. It's a big problem that hopefully someone wiser than I can solve. Appendix 2 is about type software. I think this is an important thing to point out, and maybe I should have done this up front. This book is not going to teach you how to use any design software. It's not going to teach you how to actually create a font on your PC or your Mac. She does mention a few different applications here. In 10 years, they'll probably all be out of date. And that's how these things go. So I think this is more of an evergreen book. Here are the principles for creating a typeface. I think maybe a good analogy would be like animation. If you want to make a cartoon, you go and you buy a book to study like the fundamentals and the principles of animation, and you learn Disney's 12 principles, right? Their foundation for creating good animation. And then separately, you go take a course or you read a user manual for how to use Moho or Toon Boom. So this is just an appendix in this book. You read this book, you learn how to design a typeface, but then the technical skills are going to have to be learned elsewhere to learn, one of these software, whether it's Glyphs or RoboFonts or FontLab or whatever crazy thing comes out next year, next week. You won't learn that here, but she does give a little bit of a conversation about the options. I think this is one of the best pages, one of the best spreads in the entire book, and it is further reading. It is, it's entirely 2 pages just filled with books about very specific topics. I'll go ahead and read them off for you. Type design, technical references, typography, type history, theory and criticism, lettering, type specimens, diacritic design. That'd be good for people like me who know nothing about diacritics. Here we've got 5 different further readings. Punctuation, legibility and readability. That's important, even more important now. We didn't really touch on that before, but that's become a bigger topic now. Legibility, readability, specifically in terms of accessibility, being able to read things even if you're visually impaired. Type designers, magazines and journals, and then online type reviews, other typographic resources, and typographic organizations. So I think this is just really a nice, concise, like, here's some more threads to pull on, and I fully intend to go look at all of these, along with all of the notes that I make from, reading the book for the second time, or the third time, but this edition for the second time. But again, I'll point out, these do not one-to-one correlate with the works that are cited, in some of the pages in here. I don't know if I'll be able to find one just flipping through. They were more so in the beginning. But we saw in the beginning where there were some citations and stuff like that. And these citations, they don't necessarily match up to the further reading. So don't think that you're going to be able to look here and flip back and forth or anything. One thing you can flip back and forth, though, is, oh no, you can't do it. Oh yeah, you can. Hold on. I'll go ahead and say it. You can flip back and forth with the index. So there is a spread here with an index on it. I don't know how much you're going to use the index in a book like this, because I do think the table of contents does the best job of I think the table of contents does the best job of kind of organizing a book like this, but the appendix is good if you want to see like where a certain font is. Like if I wanted to see where is Mercury, I can go to page 42 and I can go find Mercury. If I want to see a specific foundry or something like that, I can go in here and I can find Immigré, and then I can go Immigré or Immigré. I don't know. I've never actually said that word out loud, but you can go and look for something very specific in the index and then go back and find it. It's got all the page numbers, so that's nice. I skipped over the 4th appendix though, and that is typefaces and foundries. This is something that, I could understand why maybe this could be omitted, because it would be so easy to just go and search for, if I wanted to go find Abril. Let's go with Adele. If I wanted to go find Adele online and I wanted to know like, oh, who makes Adele? I'm probably going to be able to find it in about 2 seconds. But this book, unlike ChatGPT, is never going to be confidently incorrect. It's going to, you can look back here and you can always see Clarendon, and then it's got Monotype is the foundry, but then it's got original designers, and it's got all these other, like details that are going to be correct. I mean, at least 99.9% correct. I would caution a guess that all of these are perfectly correct. But if you Google something, maybe you won't find the right answer. If you use ChatGPT, I'd say there's like a 40% chance that the AI will confidently tell you the answer and it will not be right. So this is something that could have easily been omitted, but I'm happy that it's been included. And there are 2 full spreads, 4 pages, that are just the typefaces in this book and the foundries. And then a bunch more, all the type foundries here just listed by themselves with their websites. So really cool. You can look here, find the font that you want, find the type foundry, and you're going to find their website. And that's the book. We already talked about the index. Oh, got to post it in there. That's it. Nothing on the back. Go ahead and leave this on the front while I do my little conclusion. As you may have guessed, I do recommend this book. I think by now you probably have a really good idea about what this is, what's going on in this book, what this book is used for. It very much is a user manual for designing type. It has a lot of pros. I don't think that it has a lot of cons. And I think even if you're never going to design a typeface, this is a great reference to have. If you are going to design a typeface, I feel like this is pretty indispensable. I think there are a lot of companion books that would pair well with this. And if you're interested in seeing reviews and flip-throughs on those, go ahead and leave a comment and I will consider it. But yeah, this is a very, very solid reference. Not something you're going to read from beginning to end, just straight through. Not because the writing is difficult to understand or it's too formal or too technical or anything. It's a lot of information. Think of this as a user manual. Please, if you take anything away from this, Designing Type by Cheng is very much a user manual for designing type. And with that, I will end this very, very long video. I have been Curtis Simpson, and this has been the Jectives review of Designing Type by Cheng, 2nd edition.